Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye.
Joint resolution is passed.
Right. So on this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 47, and the joint resolution is passed.
Thank you.
That ends. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination. 52, the nays are 47. The joint resolution is passed.
Nomination, Department of Education, Linda McMahon of Connecticut to be Secretary.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk. Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you.
Nomination, Department of
Mr.
Education,
President,
Linda
I
McMahon of
speak
Connecticut
with
to be
senior
Secretary.
citizens all over Vermont, and in fact in many parts of the country. And just last
Senator
night,
from Vermont is recognized.
we held a telephone town hall in Vermont, and our small state with senior 34,000 people all over Vermont on the line. Many parts, and I think the reason just last night is there is a great deal of anxiety among people in Vermont, in general, and seniors in particular, 34,000 people Republican budget on the proposal. And I think the reason for that is there is a great deal of anxiety among people and Americans, seniors this country in particular, have reason regarding to be Republican budget proposal at a time of massive income and wealth inequality in the House. The Republican budget would give over $1 trillion in tax breaks reason to the top 1% at a time of billionaires' income and wealth inequality in our country. The Republican budget would give over $1 trillion in tax breaks. How are they going to pay for that $1 trillion gift that is billionaires and the wealthiest people in our country? And the answer is not complicated. And in Vermont and all over this country, seniors are asking, Republicans, how are they going massive cuts for that $1 trillion gift, nutrition assistance, 1%, affordable housing, and the answer is not complicated. These are precisely the programs that working families will be making massive cuts, and the elderly and the sick and the poor, nutrition assistance upon affordable housing and education. The Republican budget, these are precisely the programs that working families and kids and the elderly and the sick and the poor most depend upon. Mr. President, the Republican budget would cut Medicaid by $880 billion. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has estimated that if these cuts are implemented, up to 36 million Americans, including millions of children, would have their health insurance taken away from them. And let's be clear, when we have Republicans in the House passing a budget to make massive cuts in Medicaid, we're not just talking about throwing millions of kids off of the health care they need. We're also talking about massive cuts to community health centers, where some 32 million Americans receive the primary health care that they need, and where community health centers receive 43% of their funding from Medicaid. So a cut to Medicaid, a massive cut to Medicaid, is a cut to community health centers, is a cut to the services that 32 million Americans receive, including many, many seniors. Mr. President, at a time when we have a major crisis in nursing home availability in Vermont and all over this country, let us understand that Medicaid provides for 2 out of every 3 seniors who live in nursing homes. A massive cut to Medicaid is a massive cut to nursing homes and the people who utilize those homes. How many seniors would be thrown out of nursing homes if the Republicans cut Medicaid by $880 billion? Nobody knows, but it would be a disaster for working families and their parents, that is for sure. But it's not just Medicaid cuts that seniors are worried about. Today, Mr. President, nearly 22% of people over 65 years of age are trying to survive on an income of less than $15,000 a year. That is an unbelievable and horrific reality. Imagine anyone in America, in any part of this country, let alone a senior citizen, trying to survive on $15,000 a year or less. And I don't know how anybody can possibly do that, especially seniors who have health care needs and need prescription drugs, need to heat their homes more than the general public. And it's not just seniors trying to get by on $15,000. Half of our nation's seniors are trying to get by on $30,000 a year. Bottom line is, that in the richest country in the history of the world, you got millions and millions of seniors today, people who helped build this country, people who raised us. These are people who are barely getting by in the year 2025. Mr. President, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, the United States now has the dubious distinction of not only having one of the highest rates of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, we also have one of the highest rates of senior poverty compared to other wealthy nations. In America today, according to the latest OECD estimates, 23% of seniors are living in poverty compared to just 4.1% in Norway, 6.1% in France, 9.5% in Ireland, and 14.9% in the United Kingdom. That is a dubious distinction. That is something we should not be proud of. That is a crisis we should be addressing. In addition to the poverty that millions of seniors in America are experiencing today, about half of older workers, these are people in the workforce right now, people between the ages of 55 and 64 have no retirement savings at all. You're 60 years old, you've worked your entire life, and half of people in that situation, from 55 to 64, have no retirement savings at all. And as bad as all of that is, many of my Republican colleagues have proposed to make a bad situation, a tragic situation, even worse by cutting Social Security. Some want to cut benefits, others want to raise the retirement age, and then there are some who simply want to privatize Social Security and give it over to Wall Street. Well, Mr. President, I strongly disagree. I don't believe that at a time when millions of seniors are struggling to keep their heads above water, I don't believe that now is the time, in fact, never is the time, to cut Social Security benefits. Instead of cutting Social Security and giving tax breaks to billionaires, Congress must expand Social Security so that every senior in America can retire with the dignity and the respect that he or she deserves. Further, importantly for the younger generation, we must also make Social Security solvent for generations to come. So that is the goal. The goal is to say to seniors all over this country, in the richest country on earth, we're going to address the fact that many of you can't quite figure out how to buy the food you need, heat your homes, get the prescription drugs you need. You are struggling. You help build this country. You are our parents and our grandparents. We stand with you. And that is why, Mr. President, I have introduced legislation today with 10 of my colleagues, Senators Warren, Merkley, Welch, Padilla, Smith, Van Hollen, Markey, Booker, Gillibrand, and Whitehouse, to accomplish both of those goals. This legislation would make Social Security solvent for the next 75 years. It would lift millions of seniors out of poverty, and it would expand benefits for seniors and people with disabilities by $2,400 a year. Now, I know that in a world here in Washington where the government is now run by billionaires, $2,400 doesn't seem like a whole lot of money. But if you're trying to get by on $15,000 a year, you can't afford to heat your house, can't afford to buy a prescription drug that you need, $2,400 is something that will help. How do we do this? What does this legislation do? Well, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, when billionaires pay an effective tax rate lower than the average worker, this legislation demands that the wealthiest people in America, the billionaires and others, start paying their fair share of taxes. Today, absurdly and unfairly, a billionaire pays the same amount of money into Social Security as someone who makes $176,000 a year. Billionaire pays the same amount into Social Security somebody who makes $176,000 a year. And that is because there is a cap on the Social Security payroll tax. What does that mean? It means if you make up to $176,000 a year, you pay 6.2% of your income in Social Security taxes. But if you make 10 times more, $1.7 million a year, you pay just 0.62% of your income in Social Security taxes. And if you make $1 billion a year, you pay nothing more into the Social Security fund than someone making $176,000. Now, that may make sense to somebody, probably to the billionaire class, but it does not make sense to me. This legislation applies the Social Security payroll tax to all income, including capital gains and dividends, for those who make over $250,000 a year. Under this bill, 91% of households in our country would not see their taxes go up by one single penny. Not one penny for the bottom 91%. Not only is this legislation good public policy, it also happens to be precisely what the American people want. According to a Data for Progress poll, 81% of the American people, including 79% of independents and 75% of Republicans, support expanding Social Security benefits. So in passing this legislation, it's not only good policy, it is precisely what Democrats, Republicans, and independents want. Therefore, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-770, which was introduced earlier today, that the bill be considered read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Reserving the right to object, I rise today to discuss Senator Sanders' request for unanimous consent for the Senate to pass his Social Security Expansion Act. Before I do so, I want to respond to a couple of the points that were made. The accusation was once again made that Republicans are trying to cut taxes for billionaires. The reality is Republicans are trying to stop a tax increase on all Americans. The TCJA, or 2017 tax bill, is going to expire at the end of this year, and if it is not stopped from expiring, every American will get a tax increase. And those in the lower income categories and the middle income categories will share $2.6 trillion of that tax increase. That's what the tax fight's about. And then continuing what I call the politics of fear in the face of the reforms that we're bringing, the attack was, well, we're going to cut Medicaid, we're going to stop financing for community health centers, and we're going to do all these terrible things. I have not seen such a bill in this Congress, in the House or the Senate. We are debating how to get rid of fraud, waste, and abuse. We are not looking at how to cut benefits in Medicaid. And I believe that it's very clear. Today was the first time on the floor that I heard we were looking at community health centers. I wasn't aware of that either. The bottom line here is we are trying to pay attention to our $37 trillion national debt by weeding out waste, fraud, and abuse. We'll have disagreements about how to do that, but it's definitely not going to be all the things that are being brought up that are accused in order to stir people up and scare them and tell them that we should not pay attention to our national debt. Now, with regard to Social Security, we can all agree on the importance of Social Security, which provides monthly benefits to millions of seniors and individuals with their disabilities and their families. I also agree with my colleagues on the other side that Congress must act to preserve and strengthen Social Security to ensure that it's there for current beneficiaries and future beneficiaries. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, if no action is taken, the combined Social Security trust funds will be exhausted within the next 10 years, meaning the program would not be able to pay the full amount of benefits currently promised. However, I disagree with my colleagues' approach here today, and they have disagreed with our approaches. We have competing ideas about how we should address this issue. Addressing Social Security's solvency will require thoughtful discussion about a variety of policy options that culminates in a bipartisan solution, not a cram down of a different solution that we haven't even had the opportunity to have a discussion in the Finance Committee about. Instead, my Democrat colleagues are pursuing a live UC of a bill that has not received consideration before the full committee and has never had a Republican co-sponsor in the House or the Senate. This bill would also raise taxes on certain workers making less than $400,000, something my Democratic colleagues have previously promised not to do. For these reasons, I object.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today in opposition of Linda McMahon's nomination to serve as the Secretary of the Department of Education. You know, all across America, from small towns like Grand Marais to cities like Grand Rapids, public schools serve as the bedrock of our communities. As a product of Michigan public schools, the son of a public school teacher, and having watched my own 3 children attend public schools, I know firsthand the importance of public education. Education is the cornerstone of academic achievement, career development, and lifelong learning in our society. A strong public education system is critical to not only our nation's economy, but community safety, social mobility, and the health of our democracy. We need a Secretary of Education who values and respects public education and the millions of teachers and faculty who support the system. We need a Secretary of Education who will support critical funding streams like Head Start for early education, IDEA for students with disabilities, and the school meal program that ensures that no student goes to class hungry. That is why we cannot allow Mrs. McMahon to run our Department of Education. Instead of working to protect funding for the programs that support our students, improve classrooms, and help recruit the hardworking teachers that we so desperately need today, Mrs. McMahon has made it clear that she has, well, other priorities. During her committee hearing, she blatantly supported efforts to dismantle our education system, including taking funding away from our public schools and using it to make investments in private schools. Mrs. McMahon and others have tried to sell this as, quote, school choice, but we know that it is basically a voucher program that will ultimately give private schools the ability to handpick students and close their doors to everyone else. Private schools have no requirement to serve students with disabilities, students with mental health needs, or homeless students. We've already seen private school voucher programs fail in states that have actually implemented them, like Louisiana, where students who accepted vouchers experienced significant declines in their academic performance, worse than learning loss caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and Hurricane Katrina. So-called school choice does not meet the needs of our students, and American voters overwhelmingly agree. A 2024 poll found that less than a quarter of Americans support increased funding for school vouchers. Meanwhile, 68% of Americans want to boost public school funding to better support teachers and give our students and children the education and career opportunities that they certainly deserve. Under Mrs. McMahon's plan, we would be letting private schools decide who is educated and who is not. But unfortunately, we know that these private institutions will always prioritize their bottom line, and the needs of students and families will be second. If confirmed as Secretary of Education, the quality of our American education will certainly decline, and our children will ultimately suffer the consequences. I would urge my colleagues to vote no on Mrs. McMahon's nomination.
Mr. President.
Senator from California is recognized.
Mr. President, over the last few months, there's literally been more than 10,000 Californians that have made it a point to reach out to me by phone calls, by letters, by emails, to say one thing loud and clear. Stand up for public education. There's students throughout California, teachers throughout California, and parents throughout California, I'm sure beyond, in all of our states, that are afraid that Donald Trump is going to decimate federal funding for public schools. And from what we've seen, they have every right to be concerned. See, only 1 month into office, the richest president in our history has teamed up with the richest man in the world to slash public funding across the board, including in education. They've already terminated nearly $1 billion in contracts with the Education Department alone. They've fired or placed on leave Education Department staff. These are hard-working Americans dedicated to everything from protecting the civil rights of students to special education to student aid. And they're making it clear that this is just the beginning. President Trump has bragged that he actually wants to eliminate the Department of Education, threatening the quality of education of 80% of students who go to public schools. Colleagues, that's the situation. That is the context in which we find ourselves today as we consider the nomination of Linda McMahon to serve as Education Secretary. So we could talk about Linda McMahon's qualifications or frankly, lack thereof, but I'm not shocked because President Trump isn't looking for someone with the background or the commitment to strengthen education in America. He's looking for someone to destroy it. President Trump has said publicly that he wishes that Ms. McMahon would, quote, put herself out of a job. And it's clear that she's ready to do it. And to justify it, I know I've heard countless accusations of Department of Education overreach or that the department is just too big. Now, if we're saying this because of the budget cuts Republicans are starving for to underwrite the tax breaks for the wealthy, let me remind us all that the Department of Education is the smallest agency in the cabinet by a lot. The department is responsible, though, for promoting equal access to education, ensuring protections and support for students with special needs, defending the civil rights of tens of millions of students, and yes, managing the student loans and Pell Grants that students need to afford an education, just like I did when I was graduating from San Fernando High School, trying to figure out how I was going to be able to pay for college. Yet Linda McMahon and Republicans in Congress will try to sell us on the idea that education should be left to states and to local communities. Tell that to the young student who's struggling to read by the 4th grade, but whose schools don't have the resources they need to help them catch up. Tell that to the parents of an 8th grader who's behind in math, who fear that their child will never be able to make up the time that they lost during the pandemic. Now, while it's true that state and local communities play the primary role in education, it's actually the federal government that helps close the gaps. That's part of what makes our country strong, the idea that no matter where you live, no matter who your parents are or what tax bracket your family is in, you have the right to a good education. Because after all, it's the surest path to achieving your American dream. And yes, it's personal for me. As I mentioned, I'm a proud product of public education, a graduate of San Fernando High School. Go Tigers. And upon completion of my high school education, I was accepted, had the blessed opportunity to attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I earned my degree in mechanical engineering. And that led to a better life and more opportunities. Exactly what my parents worked so hard and sacrificed for. That's the American dream. And I know that by far I'm not alone. But that's why I find it outrageous that Mr. McMahon and Republicans can so callously plan to take a chainsaw to the American dreams of so many current and future students. But today, we're here to say that tens of millions of public school students are not line items on your chopping block. They deserve better. Our country is better than this. And I urge all my colleagues to reject President Trump's attempts to abolish the Department of Education and to reject Linda McMahon's nomination or any nominee who's willing to carry out his wishes. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today deeply concerned about the state of public education in our country. Public education is foundational. It allows people to get ahead. As simple as that. It's foundational. I've spoken before on the floor about the power of public education in my own life. As an immigrant from Japan, I arrived in this country speaking no English. I started off by trying to learn how to count from 1 to 10. Very humble beginnings. But it was the public education I received at schools like Kokohead Elementary and Kamiki High School that enabled me, an immigrant from very humble beginnings, to learn English and to go on to college, law school, and ultimately the U.S. Senate. We should all agree on the importance of a strong public education system for every student in our country. An educated citizenry helps grow the middle class and drive economic success in red and blue states alike. Support for public schools should not be a partisan issue. There are millions of kids who are attending public schools in every single state in our country. So it shouldn't be a partisan issue. But just weeks into the Trump administration, public education is under attack. Already, chainsaw-wielding Elon Musk. It's really hard to get rid of that image because he takes such delight in wielding that chainsaw and willy-nilly cutting all kinds of government programs that we rely on. But Elon Musk and his minions have started unilaterally canceling contracts at the Department of Education without any transparency or accountability whatsoever. And Donald Trump has made no secret of his desire to eliminate the Department of Education entirely. As part of his quest to cut government services, we rely on to give trillions in handouts to his billionaire buddies. While only Congress has the power to eliminate the Department of Education in its entirety, that is not stopping Trump from using every means available to weaken federal support for education. And as you heard from my colleague just previously, there is a lot of support for public education in our country. Why? Because most of the people in our country have to go to public schools. A person who will help him do this, meaning totally weaken our public school system and eliminate the Department of Education, is billionaire Linda McMahon. As Trump's Secretary of Education, she will dismantle the Department of Education from the inside out. President Trump told her that he wants her to, quote, put herself out of a job by eliminating this department. Since President Trump only nominates people who are 100% loyal to him, we can expect Linda McMahon will comply with putting herself out of a job, which leads us to wonder why we are even giving her this job in the first place. A nominee tasked to end the very department that she is supposed to be leading does not need to have much by way of experience in leading or running such a department, which is the case with Linda McMahon. In her confirmation hearing, Mrs. McMahon could not name a single requirement of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the main federal law that supports K-12 education. She couldn't say whether teaching African American history courses violated Trump's executive order on radical indoctrination. Teaching the history of our country is considered radical indoctrination by this president. Think about that for a minute. She couldn't even answer a simple yes or no question about whether schools receiving taxpayer dollars should be allowed to discriminate against children with disabilities. Mrs. McMahon is totally unqualified to oversee the education of our nation's children. But Donald Trump doesn't care about that. Linda McMahon will carry out President Trump's dangerous agenda to dismantle the Department of Education, privatize the nation's public schools, and strip educational opportunities from millions of students across the country. In doing so, she will be 100% loyal to Donald Trump above all else. She'll execute the plans laid out in Project 2025 to eliminate funding for Title I schools, which supports low-income students. We are talking about funding for 49,000 Title I schools throughout the country, including 170 schools in my state of Hawaii, 2,900 Title I schools in Florida, 7,500 Title I schools in Texas, and so many more. Every single state has Title I schools, 49,000 Title I schools throughout our country. Project 2025, Trump's blueprint, will have the Secretary of Education dismantle civil rights protections for students and weaponize the Office of Civil Rights to advance Trump's hateful, far-right political agenda. Then, the Secretary will come after funding for programs that help provide child care, after-school care, school meals, and more. Think about it, school meals. For many children, that would mean taking away access to the only meal a day they can count on. Why? Not because she thinks these decisions will improve outcomes or benefit students. No, these attacks on the Department of Education are about one thing and one thing only: finding money to pay for massive giveaways to billionaires like McMahon, Elon Musk, obviously the president, and their ilk. Republicans are robbing our children's futures to line the pockets of their billionaire buddies. And they're robbing our country of future doctors, innovators, leaders, and more. Mr. President, a strong public education system is the foundation of a strong democracy, a strong economy, and a strong middle class. That's why Democrats are committed to strengthening our schools and ensuring every child has the opportunity to get ahead regardless of disability, income, or background. That starts with our rejecting Linda McMahon's troubling nomination to lead the Department of Education, a department that she is going to start dismantling and indeed working herself out of a job. On behalf of students, teachers, and families in Hawaii and all across our country, I urge my colleagues to think about it, to oppose this nomination. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on the importance of the Department of Education and my grave concerns about the nomination of Linda McMahon to be the Secretary of Education. Now, President Trump has made it clear what his directive is for Linda McMahon. It's to dismantle the Department of Education. And despite President Trump stating that he has never read Project 2025, and Mrs. McMahon repeatedly stating that she's not familiar with Project 2025's proposals on higher education, it is abundantly clear that this administration is following Project 2025 to a T. Project 2025 lays out a blueprint for ending the federal government's role in public education, starting with dismantling the Department of Education so that they can find the money they need to provide tax breaks for their billionaire friends. You heard me right. Cutting public education dollars so that the richest can get richer. Eliminating the Department of Education would be absolutely devastating for students, for teachers, and parents in Wisconsin and across America. Wisconsin stands to have $235 million in Title I funding ripped away. Wisconsin stands to have over $270 million in IDEA funding, which is critical for special education, ripped away. What this means is Wisconsin teachers stand to have needed resources for their classrooms ripped away. Parents stand to have their in and out of classroom support for their children ripped away. And of course, our children stand to lose out on the public education and opportunity to learn that they deserve, regardless of their zip code. Look, we know we are facing a challenging time in the American education system. We know that as a nation, we must turn the tide and ensure that America is a global leader in educating our children. And I'm committed to working with parents, teachers, principals, and school districts to do just that. But we also know what won't help our children get a good education, and that's slashing the education budget. And we know what will help turn the tide: critical, data-driven investments in our public education system to support our children, our teachers, our schools, and our communities. It is clear that Mrs. McMahon is being nominated for this role, not to help children, but to do Mr. Trump's bidding. She comes to this role with very little experience in education, but she has a wealth of experience in Trump world. She's never been a teacher, but she did donate over $20 million to Trump's campaign and organizations that are backing him. She's never been a school administrator, but she does sit on the board of directors for Trump Media and Technology Group. In this critical time, we need to be providing our students and schools with more support, not less. And I urge my colleagues to join me in voting no on her nomination. And I yield the floor.
Senator from Arizona is recognized.
As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of SR 103, which was submitted earlier today. Further, that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Objection is heard.
Okay. Mr. President, 3 years ago, when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, many people, including experts, believed Putin would crush Ukraine's democracy in days. They were wrong. About 1 month before the war broke out, I traveled to Ukraine with a bipartisan coalition of House representatives to meet with Ukrainian soldiers. The soldiers we met, they knew that they were up against one of the strongest militaries in the world, but they refused to back down when it came to fighting for their families, their freedom, and their future. These soldiers are the reason why, against all odds, Ukraine still stands strong. Over 3 years, the scrappy little country of Ukraine has grinded down the second most powerful military in the world. Ukraine is holding the line for democracy, and they are doing it with our support. But Monday's vote at the UN undermined that, and it was a betrayal of Ukraine, America's allies, democracy, and everything we have stood for as a country. Let's be clear on this. This is a war that Russia started. Ukraine did not ask for it. They did not ask to go to war with a nuclear superpower, and they did not ask for their cities to be reduced to rubble. They didn't ask for their children to be displaced and families to be torn apart. If Ukraine had its way, this war would have ended years ago. What happened at the UN puts us on the same side as Russia and North Korea. That's not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. It sent a message to our allies and every other country that relies on the U.S. to stand up to bullies and defend that America can defend them and help them defend themselves, that America cannot be relied on to rightfully call out unprovoked aggression. It told them that they are on their own, that America's words means nothing. If we can stand up against these criminals, if we can stand up against pariah states like Russia, how can we expect the world to take us seriously as leaders of democracy? So this is why I'm introducing this resolution. I urge my colleagues to correct the mistake we made at the UN this week. Stand with our allies and condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. America does not stand with dictators, and we never will, and we shall never. With that, I ask for consent and vote on my resolution.
Mr. President,
Yes.
was there a unanimous consent request?
No, there wasn't.
I'm sorry. Mr. President, what was the consent request?
Can the senator repeat the request, please?
I withhold my request.
Okay.
Mr. President,
Senator from California is recognized.
Mr. President, I urge you to beware the temptation of labeling both sides equally at fault.
Time's expired, Senator.
May I have consent to speak for 2 minutes?
Is there objection? Yes, objection heard.
2 minutes? So it's going to take longer, I'm just telling you.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
If we could be done in 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Senator Ernst, you objected. Is that okay? Withdrawn. Okay, the senator from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleagues for their courtesy to speak on this resolution. I urge you to beware of the temptation of labeling both sides equally at fault, the temptation to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. My colleagues, these are not my words. They are, of course, the words of Ronald Reagan almost 42 years ago to the day. Imagine if he could see his party now, turning its back on our ally and fellow democracy, Ukraine, sponsoring a UN resolution that would whitewash the start of the war, engaging in the most immoral equivalence, and failing to assign responsibility to Russia for its invasion and ruthless aggression, voting with Russia and North Korea against our longtime friends and allies in Europe and around the world, abandoning and insulting our allies as Putin seeks to remake the map of Europe. And what is this resolution in the United States about that we helped defeat? The U.S. has used its influence and its vetoes in the Security Council many times, but this resolution was offered by dozens of our close allies on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What was in it that was so objectionable to split the U.S. from its friends? The resolution made clear that Russia started this war. It reaffirmed the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. It deplored Russian aggression on women and children. It raised concerns with North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces. It noted the threat to nuclear safety. It called for an end to the war and a just and lasting peace and the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukrainian lands. None of this is in dispute, none. This was the resolution that the U.S., the leader of the free world, blocked at the United Nations. Can any member of this body point to a single problematic word in that resolution? Of course not. The Senate should stand by that resolution, even as we must stand by Ukraine. Today, the White House and Kremlin seek to rewrite the history of this war with falsehood and slander, calling Zelensky the dictator, Ukraine the instigator, and Putin the hero. We need to do more than say something. We need to do something. Slava Ukraini.
Mr. President.
The majority whip.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to waive the mandatory quorum call with respect to the McMahon nomination.
The clerk will report the nomination to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Linda McMahon of Connecticut to be Secretary of Education, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent of the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Linda McMahon of Connecticut to be Secretary of Education shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blackburn, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Britt, Capito, Collins, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Hoven, Husted, Johnson, Langford, Lee, Marshall, McConnell, Moody, Moran, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Tillis, Tuberville, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Hassan, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kim, Lujan, Merkley, Sanders, Schiff, Shaheen, Van Hollen, and Wyden. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye.
Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. McCormick, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Haggerty, Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Sheehy. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Miss Slotkin, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no.
The ayes are 51, the nays are 47, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President.
I recognize the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that all post-closure time on the McMahon nomination be expired. Further, that the Senate vote on confirmation of the nomination at 5:30 p.m. on Monday, March 3rd. And finally, if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative business and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 2S9.
The clerk will call the roll. The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 2S9, a bill to provide for that the purposes of determining compliance with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 in athletics, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk for the motion to proceed.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 2S9, a bill to provide that for purposes of determining compliance with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 in athletics, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 16, S-Res 94.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 16, S-Res 94, authorizing expenditures by committees of the Senate for the, and so forth.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration of S-Res 104, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 104 designating February 27, 2025 as Rare Disease Day.
Is there objection to the proceeding to the motion? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the S-Res 12 be indefinitely postponed.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 9 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 3 p.m. on Monday, March 3rd, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the 2 leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of executive calendar number 24, the McMahon nomination under the previous order. Finally, following disposition of the McMahon nomination, the Senate proceed to legislative session and resume consideration of calendar number 2S9, and that the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed.
Without objection.
Mr. President, if there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of my colleagues.
Without objection.
Let me just restate unanimous consent request that S.J. Res 12 be indefinitely postponed.
Duly noted. Recognize the senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as we celebrate Public Schools Week, Senate Republicans are preparing to confirm Linda McMahon, another of President Trump's billionaire patrons, as Secretary of Education, and I oppose such nomination. During her confirmation hearing, Mrs. McMahon demonstrated little knowledge of public education or the basic programs and functions of the Department of Education. Clearly, the choice of this nominee was not based on merit. But that does not matter because Mrs. McMahon was selected to be up front as the agency she hopes to lead is being dismantled by Elon Musk and Doge. Indeed, while Ms. McMahon was at her confirmation hearing, claiming that she would work to improve the Department of Education, Elon Musk's Doge minions were at work firing people, taking back grants, compromising sensitive data, and laying the groundwork to eliminate the entire agency. And on Valentine's Day, President Trump's Department of Education threatened to cut federal funding from public schools, as well as colleges and universities, if they did not eliminate any program that the Trump administration deems as promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. During her confirmation hearings, Ms. McMahon seemed unsure whether this edict meant that schools can't celebrate or teach classes on African American history or host clubs like Special Olympics or Girls Who Code. As a reminder, by law, the Secretary of Education may not interfere with the content that schools teach, nor the academic standards that they set. Mrs. McMahon doesn't seem to know that. By the way, while Mr. Musk has been tearing the Department of Education apart from the inside, Republicans in Congress have passed punitive budget blueprints that will cut trillions from government services to the American people, including education, all to pay for tax cuts for the richest Americans and the biggest businesses. In the Senate, the Republicans are calling for an unspecified $9 trillion in cuts. In the House, the Education and Workforce Committee must provide a minimum of $330 billion in cuts from education and drought training programs. It's no wonder that educators, students, and families from across the country feel under siege. We know what this looks like because we see how teachers, students, and military families are reacting with dismay as our world-class Department of Defense schools are laboring under another secretary intent on politicizing his department and promoting an indoctrination agenda authorized by President Trump. I would like to take a moment to first thank all educators, school staff, family volunteers, and all community members who tirelessly work to equip our students for the future. We owe you a debt of gratitude and so much more than that. We need to recommit to strengthening our public schools and to investing in them. In the first part of the 20th century, it was the high school movement that broadly expanded educational attainment, preparing young Americans for success in a changing world and evolving economy. This movement featured professional educators and engaged families and communities. It was about general knowledge and practical application. This movement launched the United States as a world economic power. It was essential to our national defense, and it created the conditions for the success of the largest expansion of post-secondary education through the GI Bill. The high school movement meant that soldiers returning from World War II already had high school diplomas and were ready for post-secondary education. Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the Higher Education Act are some of our federal laws that work to ensure that opportunities to learn and advance are not limited by income, race, ethnicity, or disability. The expansion of public education is a great American story. Yet today, it sometimes seems to have been forgotten. Some argue that we do not need public schools. We can offer vouchers or education savings accounts or homeschooling instead. Today, instead of freedom of inquiry and inclusion, we see policing of what schools can teach, what students can read, what they can discuss, and how they should think. This is a recipe for stifling creativity and the development of the skills needed for an ever-changing knowledge economy. We politicize and neglect public schools at our peril. They educate nearly 50 million students and our future. It is time that we treat public education as the priority it must be if we want a brighter future for our children and our grandchildren and our country. We should embark on a new public school movement, one that will strengthen and support the education profession, one that will ensure that all communities can provide modern, state-of-the-art facilities, one that will ensure all students have the right to read, with evidence-based reading instruction, school libraries, books at home, diverse materials, and the freedom to choose what to read. Today, we are failing our public schools because we are not investing in them. For example, the average age of our public school facilities is 49 years. The GAO found that over half of our school districts in our country needed to replace or update major systems in more than half their buildings. As a nation, we should commit to modernize our school facilities, and that's why I will be reintroducing the Rebuild America's Schools Act to invest $130 billion in our school facilities in the communities with the greatest need. We know there is a crisis in the education profession. Too many school districts struggle to hire and train teachers. Too often a career in teaching means financial struggles and little support to meet student needs. Additionally, we need a national focus on literacy. In 2024, the percentage of 8th graders reading below the basic level on the National Assessment of Educational Progress was the largest in the assessment's history. And the percentage of 4th graders who scored below the basic level was the largest in 20 years. And adults are not doing any better. Recent results of the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies show that overall scores in literacy and numeracy have decreased for U.S. adults, with adults scoring at the lowest level of proficiency in literacy increasing from 19% in 2017 to 28% in 2023. This is a crisis. Eliminating the Department of Education does nothing to solve it. Instead of gutting educational funding and eliminating the Department of Education to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy, Congress should address the acute literacy crisis of both adults and children across the nation. We should be increasing funding for adult education, at least doubling it. We should increase resources for schools to provide evidence-based reading instruction by fully funding Title I. Increase funding for the Comprehensive Literary Development State Grant Program and for innovative approaches to literacy grants. We should double the Pell Grant and restore its purchasing power so students do not have to rely mostly on loans to pay for college. Sadly, none of this is on Ms. McMahon's agenda. I urge my colleagues to join me in ushering in a new public education movement, a movement to ensure that this generation, as well as future ones, have the foundation to achieve their full potential and build a prosperous future. The nominee is not the person to lead such an effort. All indications are that she will actively work against it, so I encourage my colleagues to vote no on her confirmation. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor. Also note, Mr. President, an absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alster Brooks.